My friends, good day. In August 1953, the Shah of Iran took a little trip on the sly abroad. Meanwhile, there were operatives from the British MI6, the British Secret Services, assisted by the CIA, who arrived in Iran to overthrow the Prime Minister. That was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh had committed a crime of lèse-majesté. When he came to power in 1951, he nationalized Iranian oil. He said Iranian oil would now be managed by the country. We'll sell it to you if you want, you pay, we give it to you, but it can't stay under your control. The British never forgave him. For 2 years, they did everything they could to bring him down in order to protect the interests of the BP company. BP wasn't called BP back then, but still we have a state, the United Kingdom, asking for help from another, the United States. They had to be forced, the United States. Obama even apologized for that at one point, for fomenting a coup abroad to protect the interests of financial powers. So what happens is that the Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, ends up imprisoned in his own home. He will remain imprisoned in complete isolation until 1967. Accused, believe it or not, of treason, even though he wanted to save the hydrocarbons and protect the economic interests and sovereignty of his country. Meanwhile, the traitors who were selling the oil and putting the money in their personal accounts, well, they were the ones accusing him of treason. He was locked up in there because he was considered a traitor. In 1967, he died at the age of 84. They were so afraid that they hid his death, even buried him at home to avoid a public procession, even to the cemetery. Well, the Shah of Iran, during that time, what he did was he started to take action. On one side, there's his secret police, the Savak, who started imprisoning, making people disappear, torturing the opposition. The opposition, any form of dissent, is crushed. Meanwhile, he and his family are getting richer. He becomes more and more megalomaniacal. He starts showing up with all sorts of trinkets, all sorts of medals that he pins on his chest. And he ends up giving himself some pretty unbelievable titles, including Light of the Aryans. After a while, he's someone who's completely out of control. During the 1970s, we have the neighboring country, Iraq. Iraq at that time is ruled by Saddam Hussein. Hussein is almost as much of a megalomaniac as the Shah. He's a brute, a thug, a rather uneducated man who sometimes showed up dressed like a pimp in a white suit in parliament with a gold gun. He collected gold-plated weapons. And then he could point out, he had a list in his hand, he could point out members of parliament or others and have them executed the same day. He was very paranoid and he always felt like someone was out to get him. Iran and Iraq, there were tensions. And in particular, in addition to the usual rivalries, there were tensions related to the border. So you should know that Iraq has very little access to the sea. If you look at Iran, it has thousands of kilometers of coastline on several seas, on several fronts, whereas Iraq only has 58 kilometers of coastline. So this will stifle it, this will prevent its development. That's why, in fact, much later, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, because he wanted that access to the sea. In any case, the point of contention between the two countries was a border area called Shatt al-Arab. Shatt al-Arab is an extremely important river. You know, everyone knows the Euphrates and the Tigris. So if you take the Euphrates and the Tigris, these two great rivers, well, imagine a Y. And they come together at some point to form a common trunk, which is the vertical bar of the Y. This common trunk is called Shatt al-Arab. It's a large river that ends in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. For Iraq, this river was very important. And then there was actually a debate with Iran about the exact ownership of this river. In 1975, through Algeria, through President Houari Boumediene, well, we're going to have an extraordinary image where on one side we have the Shah of Iran and on the other side we have Saddam Hussein. And they will sign the Algiers Agreement. It's an agreement that will define the Shatt al-Arab as the border between the two countries. Even in Europe or elsewhere, there are many rivers that serve as natural borders between countries, like the Rhine, for example, between France and Germany. That border is still recognized by the international community to this day. In any case, we're going to get to 1979. In 1979, we have a Shah who has become weak, who is unpopular, who is sick, who has indulged himself, who has exhausted the patience of the people. We have a street that can't take it anymore, and we have someone very strong named Al-Ruhullah al-Khomeini. Mr. al-Khomeini had been in exile since the 1960s. He had lived in Iraq, and then at some point we find him in France, near Fontainebleau. I think it was near Fontainebleau. And then he will lead a revolution, the Islamic revolution. This revolution will bring down the Shah of Iran. At one point from France, he will rent a Boeing 747 from the French and then arrive on it. And many of his companions, his fellow travelers, and also many journalists will arrive with him. A point about Al-Ruhullah Khomeini. Al-Khomeini is a man, a mystic, and someone who was considered, before becoming the Ayatollah, before taking the title of Ayatollah, he had the title of Marja. That means he was someone who was considered a source of reference. When he issued a fatwa, the fatwas were recognized as such. So, Mr. Khomeini wrote about 40 to 50 books, many of which can be found online. Books about, among others, about Islamic jurisprudence. And when you read them, most of the time you'll find a classic revolutionary discourse. If you've read Karl Marx or listened to the long speeches of Castro or read Vladimir Lenin or others, you won't really feel out of place when you read the speeches or texts of Khomeini. Khomeini is a man who uses revolutionary discourse, and regarding his assessment, if you will, you can't really say he's wrong. He talks about imperialism, he talks about injustice, he talks about dispossession, he talks about things like that. And of course, it's not the countries that overthrew a democratic regime to help a publicly traded company that are going to say he's wrong. So regarding the observation, unfortunately, everyone shares these revolutionary observations. There's no one who can read this kind of text and say he's wrong. However, where Khomeini will be wrong, and I'm not saying this from my personal perspective, like me, Aldo Sterone, I say he's wrong. That's not it. Time has proven him wrong, and that's the worst thing that can happen. Why? Because this man, who was originally a mystic, who was influenced by the philosophy of Ibn Sina Avicenna, he was influenced by Mullah Sadra. He was also influenced by probably the greatest mystic who ever lived, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi. Ibn al-Arabi, if you want to read him, I recommend you read the books of Ibn al-Arabi that are commented on by William Chittick, because without the commentary, it's very, very difficult to access the text of Ibn al-Arabi. And he's someone who, even though he doesn't mention them in his books, you can also feel a very strong influence of Stoic philosophy. By the way, when Khomeini landed in Tehran on the Air France plane, there was a journalist who asked him, a French journalist, "How do you feel today?" So she was really expecting an emotional response. He spent 15 years in exile since the mid-60s. He went through several countries, all that. Then he returns triumphantly to Iran after overthrowing the fleeing Shah's regime. So she expects an emotional response. And what is Khomeini going to say to her? He's going to tell her, "I don't feel anything at all." And that says a lot about the man. He wasn't someone who was living in the moment, in the emotion. Today I'm sad. Today I'm happy. Today I'm euphoric. These are people who live on another level. And it's very important to know them, to know this, in order to understand their psychology, to know how they react. So, I'm telling you, I allowed myself to say that he was wrong, because for him, the answer to imperialism, to injustice, was to start an Islamic revolution. It was like, well, here it is, Islam rules. We pray, we're going to impose the word of God on earth. It's not just in Iran. He is very, very globalist on these issues. He's not someone who will hide it. So what will happen is, and this is where he acted, he made a common revolutionary mistake. If you look, for example, at Karl Marx, he wrote Capital, the critique of politics and political economy. Sorry. Well, what happened is that, okay, the observation. I challenge you to read this book today and say, look, he's wrong. because what we see over there, what he described back in the 1800s, is still valid today. We see it around us every day. However, the real issue lies with the solution itself, which is why Karl Marx often argued with his followers. For example, one of them, Bakunin, what did he say? Bakunin, he told Karl Marx, and we'll see Khomeini's mistake. He told him, okay, you criticize the state, which at the time was called the bourgeois state, and you want a proletarian state. Because Karl Marx is fundamentally statist. Of course, he thinks that a strong state is a step toward communist fulfillment, etc. But fundamentally, Karl Marx is statist. Well, what some people like Proudhon or Bakunin will tell him is that once the proletarians sit in the seats of the bourgeois, they will themselves become the state, and they will do exactly the same thing. They will commit the same crimes against the people. These people will stop talking and fall out with each other. And in fact, time will prove Proudhon and Bakunin right. Because later, in the 1900s, Karl Marx had died. We come to proletarian revolutions in several countries around the world, like in Russia, for example. And what happens? Well, the people who sat in the seats of the previous regimes caught their disease. That reminds us of a quote from Jacques Vergès, the famous French lawyer. Well, Jacques Vergès said, they catch it through their behinds. By sitting on those people's seats, they became like them. The regime became like them. Well, that's exactly what happened with Iran. It's that And by the way, since Bakunin and Proudhon and others are more of an anarchist tendency, it means that if they were alive today, they would be paying in Bitcoin. These are people who believe in a decentralized currency, but beyond that, they believe in a decentralized state. They don't believe in this autonomous identity that calls itself the state. And then who controls our lives? Who claims to own our freedoms, to own our income, to own even our organs, even our souls, you see? So that's a different conversation. I can tell you more about it. I can tell you about it from back then, and I think I can even reveal to you right now that I'm pretty close to that position myself. So, as I was saying, Khomeini comes to power. So we have the revolution, the Islamic revolution. Iran turns into a theocracy. And what will happen next? What happens is that just the following year, in 1980, Saddam Hussein, whom we mentioned earlier, decides to have his soldiers cross the river we talked about. They cross it, arrive in Iran, and start shooting. So at that moment, it's the Iran-Iraq war. It's a war that will shape the balance in the Middle East. It's a war that will change things in a very, very, very profound way. Why? Because we have two very powerful countries, Iran and Iraq. At the end of this war, these countries are extremely weakened, drained countries. If it hadn't been for this war, we wouldn't have someone, for example, who weighs 45 kilos like Macron, who gets slapped by his wife in front of everyone, who would be calling Iran today to try to talk to them, to give orders and say, don't do this, don't do that, men are fighting, and he steps in to talk. He wouldn't have spoken up without that war. So as I was saying, when this war starts, well, pretty quickly, weapons start circulating. They'll come from the United States, from South Africa, often passing through Israel, which is quite surprising, you might say, how weapons destined sometimes for Iran, for Iraq, and this is documented, pass through Israel. In fact, the reality is that if we look at this geostrategic picture, we're in a game of chess. We're not playing checkers here. If you look at it from the Israeli perspective, they say to themselves, we have these two big Muslim countries that potentially could have one or the other, if not both, turned against us. So now, if they're killing each other, let's help them. Let's help make the war last as long as possible. That way, they'll both end up on their knees, which, by the way, is what happened. At one point during the 1970s, the United States was selling a huge amount of weapons to Iran. Most of them, by the way, some of those helicopters and other weapons are still in operation. They're very old now, but they're still used in Iran. So what happened is that the 1980s came, this war started, and suddenly the American administration said, we're not going to sell you weapons anymore. When you see it, you think, wow, that's awful. Reagan told them, no, I'm putting a blockade on you. I'm not selling you weapons. So what happened is that we're here in the logic of the blockade industry. That is, when you look at the blockade, I talk about it in one of my books, The Great Betrayers, there's a whole chapter on the blockade industry. In reality, Contrary to what people might think, people believe that a blockade is to prevent a country from accessing technology or weapons or whatever. No, that's not true. That's not how it works in practice. That's just on paper. That's what is said. Because in reality, when you see what actually happened, the moment Reagan imposed the blockade on Iran, well, the White House started selling weapons to Iran. But then what's the difference? This time the price doubled, because when there's a blockade, it raises prices, it increases margins. So it's simply a matter of the power of money. So what will happen is that the White House for years will sell weapons to Iran. The money collected goes into a slush fund that's used by the CIA to foment coups in Latin America, in Nicaragua, and to finance terrorist groups in Nicaragua. What will happen at some point is that a plane crashes, and then that's it. It's very conspicuous. Planes that crash, unfortunately, there's a survivor. He's going to talk. The press gets interested, and suddenly we have what was called Iran Gate. Look up Iran Gate. It's probably after Epstein, it's probably the biggest. It's the biggest one. It's the biggest political scandal of the last 50 years. We discover the Iran-Contra affair, which is that, well, the White House sells weapons to Iran and then uses the money to arm the Contras in Nicaragua. In fact, this will continue practically up to the present day. If you look, for example, remember when there was that story about Takadine, Pasqua, and all that stuff in court as part of the oil for food money affair. Because at one point, Saddam was on his knees. He needed to sell oil to buy medicine for his people. And do you remember what happened? Well, the entire French political class, well, they all fed at the trough. They all took, because they told him, they went to Saddam, they said, you give us money. He gave them oil certificates since they didn't have access to the money because it was an exchange, it was oil for food bartering. And there was an office at the UN that handled the compensation. And actually, what happened is that he showered the entire French political class with oil certificates, and they lined their pockets with them. Whenever you hear about a blockade on a country, whether it's on Russia, Iran, or any other country, know that there are people making money from it, typically politicians in the Western world. So, as I was saying, what's going to happen is that this war will become an unspeakable horror. At some point, Saddam Hussein will use chemical weapons against the Iranians. If you look on the UN website, there are testimonies. I read some of them. I couldn't read them all. Horrors that people describe. He used sarin, mustard gas, all kinds of nasty stuff that he used, that he dropped by plane on the Iranians. Where did the gas come from? They came from gas specialists, most often from Germany. That means there were about 80 companies, 80 German companies that supplied him with the gas, knowing what he was going to do with it. An American company was also on the second list. Some of these names are known, have been revealed by the UN, by investigators, and some of these names are still protected to this day. In any case, this gives a very particular taste. When 2 weeks ago, Merz, the Prime Minister of Germany, said that international law should not protect Iran, that just means leave us alone and we'll do it again like we did in the 80s, all right? He doesn't consider Iranians, for his part, as humans. So he wanted to go for another term. There are statements that carry a lot of weight when you look at the historical context. We get to 88. Both countries are drained at that point. Iran is on its knees economically, in terms of human lives, everything. Iraq is also on its knees. It's also worth noting that recently, some documents have come out showing that the British also helped. They helped the Iranian regime to, how should I put it, suppress all resistance. I'm losing my words, sorry. I should have a teleprompter. So as I was saying, to suppress all resistance, to suppress all opposition. They did it at one point because the opposition to the Tehran regime was a leftist opposition. It was rather communist. And so what happened is that the British, doing the dirty work for the Americans, well, what they did, they said to each other, we prefer the Islamist regime. Rather than letting Iran fall to the communists and potentially get closer to Russia or China. So what they did was they helped. To be clear, they helped. So they're pretending. Be careful of double talk. There are always double standards when they speak, and condemnations on one side, but selling chemical gas on the other, condemnations, but helping them on the other side, and so on. So it's always something. You really, really have to be careful about that. You don't have a Western politician or anyone else for that matter who comes, talks to you and tells you the truth. There's always double talk and always a double meaning. So as I was saying, what happened in 1988? Both countries are on their knees. So what's going to happen? We also have the USS. It's very symbolic. We have the USS Vincennes. It's an American ship that was hanging around in the Persian Gulf that will lock onto an Airbus. It will fire 2 missiles at an Airbus. I believe it was an Airbus carrying 300 civilians. Well, it's going to kill several hundred people, about 60 children. And then what happened is that George Bush refused to apologize, even though some money was given to the victims as compensation. And the captain of the USS Vincennes, who was looking for trouble, who had been very provocative in the region for a long time, was promoted. He received a medal and all that. And at that moment, the Iranians, because you have to understand, you really have to understand their logic. The Iranians understood that they were screwed. They understood that that's it. They were attacked, they were gassed, a civilian plane was shot down. Nobody cares. And so they understood that the only solution was to make peace with Iraq. Iraq was also interested in making peace because it couldn't continue either. So we're going to have this peace that will come about. Peace will happen in 88. The Airbus was in 88, and I think peace happened in 88 or 89. What happens is that around that time, we have Ayatollah Khomeini, who starts to get old. There's an interesting book where we find his correspondence. In one letter, he writes to someone whom he affectionately refers to as Fatih. In his letters, we find a man different from what we know of him publicly. It's often like that with strong people. So he calls her Fatih, and that's Fatima Tabatabai, who is his daughter-in-law. And it's funny that he calls her Fatih because Fatima is quite a sacred name among Shiites. So calling Fatima Fatih is a bit surprising coming from him. In any case, he opens the letter like this, just to show you what state of mind he's in towards the end of his life. He's exhausted by age, by the war, by all of that. He tells her, you succeeded. You succeeded despite my age, my illness, and my extremely busy schedule. You managed to get me to sit down and write you a letter to reply to you. And then he tells her, every day I feel the assistance of the angel of death around me. And I feel that one of these days, in the coming days, I will be handed the black pages of my deeds. I am on the verge of passing to the hereafter, maybe even on the verge of falling into hell. And then he says, regarding these black pages, I have no explanation. I have no words, I have no explanation except to rely on divine grace. And I will quote, a Quranic verse that you will rarely hear. Say, O my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. He says, you who have sinned against yourselves, who have done things, who may have done wrong, who have committed sins, who are in this situation, sinning against oneself means that we do not actually sin against God. We always sin against ourselves. Well, do not despair of divine grace. La taqnutu min rahmatillah. Do not despair of divine grace. God forgives all sins. And in fact, what's extraordinary is that at that moment, we realize that this Shia sensibility is closer to the Christian sensibility than to the Sunni sensibility. Why? Because we realize here that one of the fundamental points is that he doesn't expect to be saved by his actions, but to be saved by grace. In a Sunni context, there's an accounting system with what is called the hasana, which is a positive point and the negative point, and then it's counted. You have an Excel file, click, click, click. If you have more good than bad points, you have a positive balance and make it through. Your actions determine your salvation. Whereas for Christians, it's not by actions, and for Shiites, it's the same. It's not by actions, it's by divine grace. Because if it were by actions, your dog would be saved and you wouldn't be. So I was telling you that you realize that in private, he's not going to say, I created an Islamic republic, I founded a powerful theocracy, all that, and that's what's going to save me. No, no. He says, I have no answer to give. I have dark pages and I have nothing to say, except that I count on divine grace as a humble sinner. So, do these letters allow us to get into his thoughts as a private person? The war will end around 89. Roughly speaking, in 1989, the Iran-Iraq war will end. Both countries are exhausted. Just a short time after, Iraq is in such bad shape that it has no choice but to try to attack Kuwait, which is still holding on a little. For him, for Saddam, it was the only way out. And then, at that moment, the Westerners come down on him. The guy they used to be friends with, the one they supplied with chemicals, this time they're accusing him. They accused him of having weapons of mass destruction. And how did they know he had weapons of mass destruction? They were the ones who sold them to him. They were constantly selling and delivering them to him. There were plenty of Boeing 747s taking off from Germany, taking off from Amsterdam, registered in South Africa, taking off. And then afterwards, in flight, they would change their flight plan and they would go land in Baghdad with all the chemicals they were dropping on the population. And besides, to his credit, he never cheated with the merchandise. It's a bit of a change from Ziaul Haq. In Pakistan, I'll explain later, he used to stash goods. He diverted and resold the weapons he received. Saddam was very honest about that. The chemicals he received, he used them all on the Iranians, so when we came down on him, we found nothing. In any case, what happened is that we're going to meet again. I'm telling you the story. Why am I telling you all this? You have to know that the history of Iran is a very complex story, but it's also heavily based on manipulations and Western interventions. It means that what we have today is, in a way, the result of all these very cynical policies. A lot of duplicity, crimes against humanity constantly for decades by different regimes. He died in 89. I'm telling you this from memory. I can't remember if he died in 89 or 86. You know, I have a visual memory and sometimes I mix up the numbers. 6 and 9, they look alike. I was saying that Ayatollah Khomeini is going to die. When he dies, he will be replaced by someone called Ali Khamenei. Ali Khamenei, he's not the author of 40 or 50 books. He's not someone who was a marja. He's not someone who was a reference. He's not as strong theologically as Khomeini. But still, he takes the title of Ayatollah and he will become the spiritual leader of the country. He died in an American bombing last month. So in reality, the Islamic Revolution from its beginning until February was only two men. It was Khomeini and then Khamenei. Afterwards, when Khamenei dies in a bombing, he was 86 years old. It's his son Mujtaba who will replace him. So we have Mujtaba Khamenei from the same family taking over. And be careful now. Someone who is younger, we have someone who is more radical than his father. His father was, for example, against the atomic bomb. So now we have to look at these people. They are against the atomic bomb. They look a bit at how the IAEA says there is no nuclear program in Iran. The nuclear agency, which is under the UN, has and for years actually had free reign to come to Iran and inspect as it wanted. Trump bombed Iran last June 2025, saying, we destroyed everything, there's nothing left. And then suddenly they come back and say, oh, no, actually, they do have it. So in reality, we're in a circular logic. The more the country denies having a nuclear program, the more we bomb it, insisting it does. After bombing, we claim we've destroyed its nuclear program. A few months later, we return to find it has a nuclear program, leaving no way out. And now we have Mujtaba Khamenei. His father was killed in American and Israeli strikes. His wife was also killed, as well as some of his family members and close ones. The country has buried children with JCBs. So you can imagine that he's extremely upset, especially since he sees that North Korea is now launching missiles toward the Sea of Japan. Today they're saying they've increased the arsenal of these big nuclear warheads. No one is causing them any trouble. They're calmly sipping papaya juice while watching the events unfold. The TV, because we're in a world indeed where there is no international law, no humanitarian law, there's nothing at all. I mean, it's just that we're moving more and more toward this world, toward this vision that I was trying to avoid. Personally, there was a time when I was close to this vision, which is a Hobbesian vision of Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher. He was born roughly, I think, toward the end of I'm saying this from memory, I'm not too sure, the 1500s. Yes, roughly, I think I'll put my money on it, the second half of the 1500s. Well, Thomas Hobbes said that the natural state of man is the war of all against all. The war of all against all is the natural state of man, and today we are heading towards that. Trump attacking Iran, Israel attacking Iran and Lebanon. Then we have Trump wanting to take Greenland, Trump attacking Venezuela and taking its president, imprisoning him. And then what he does is say that the oil money will be funneled into offshore accounts. I mean, we have China threatening Taiwan. They're building an armada around Taiwan. We have NATO moving up to the Russian borders to provoke a geostrategic sensitivity that leads Russia to attack Ukraine. And then afterwards, we start fueling this war and making sure it lasts as long as possible, so that it kills as many Slavic brothers as possible who will kill each other while being applauded. I mean, my friends, that's it. It's a disaster. And today we have Iran striking the Gulf countries. We have the Gulf countries now having problems with the Americans. They have problems among themselves. We also have drones coming from who knows where. Iran says, it's not mine. There's probably some false flag going on. So that's the situation we're in today. But I wanted to tell you why this long video, why all these details I'm giving you. It's just to tell you that things don't happen by chance, simply. That it's not a coincidence. It's not just like that. Things don't just fall from the sky, and it's not unfair, and the world isn't just like that, and we don't just get a cow appearing out of nowhere. No, there are stories behind it. I started this video in 1953. I could have gone further back. I could have started it a century earlier. But in 1953, I thought it was a good starting point. But there you go, my friends. Always look at the bigger picture. There you go. I'll see you in another video. Thank you for your support. Nowadays, I'm making more and more videos that are in the paid section of YouTube because sometimes there are videos. I don't necessarily want to share them with a very large audience. I put them in the paid section, which also allows people to support my work because it's not free work either. It's very complex work that takes a lot of time. And I really appreciate the people who subscribe to help me. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.